Dr. Sam Parnia is a PhD in cell biology. He's an MD. He focuses on cardiopulmonary resuscitation. He currently serves at New York University's Langone Medical Center. And he's a part of, his focus in research has been on near-death experiences. And actually, he's really started on just what happens to the brain when you're in cardiac arrest and how can we help people come back to life? How can we preserve their brain so it's not damaged and cool it off so that when we can resuscitate them, they might actually survive with minimal brain damage. So that's where his research began. But then he starts listening to these stories, these near-death experience stories of people who had coded, who had gone into cardiac arrest and had enough time had passed that there was no more oxygen flowing to the brain. That happens in about 20 seconds. No more oxygen flowing to the brain through the blood coursing through it. And so the brain flatlines. And then he finds 2 or 3 minutes later, there are things that are going on as he's interviewing these people who came back, he finds out that when their brain had no brain activity and they should not have been able to process what was going on, they were actually hearing what was happening in the emergency room, the operating room. And so, these are folks who are describing, and they describe these stories. Then he checks with the doctors. Did you say this? The nurse, did you say that? And he finds out that is exactly what they said at a time when they should not have been able to hear and process information with the brain. It was shut down. And so he begins to ask the question, well, does that maybe point to the fact that there's something more to human consciousness than just brain activity? Is it possible that our human consciousness is integrally, wound up with our brain physiology while we're alive, but it's actually something different from simply our brain? Maybe there's something more. And so he's asking this question as a non-religious person. He's not coming at it with a Christian trying to prove something. He's just saying, the evidence seems to point to the fact that human consciousness continues for some period of time after we no longer have brain activity, which tells us something about, many times I've sat with people with families and their loved one had just died, and we continue to talk about their loved one around the bedside after they're gone. And based on what Dr. Parnia says, it sounds like maybe they're hearing that, right? But he's also saying maybe that human consciousness, we have to at least be open to the fact that human consciousness continues, if it's not simply a function of the brain, that it continues even after the body is completely dead, which points us to what the Apostle Paul has said, and the early church said, and Jesus said, that there's more to us than simply our physical body. And so, the Apostle Paul says it this way, when this earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building not made by human hands, eternal in the heavens. He talked about a new body in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. These are ideas that we have in Scripture that perhaps Dr. Parnia is pointing to the reality behind or the science behind it. Now, other people, of course, have different ways of explaining that. So if you're an atheist, you look at this and you say, no, it's just brain. We just don't understand how the brain physiology is working yet, and the brain is shutting down, and therefore. But when you study the stories, it appears that there's something more happening here. So he says 10% of cardiac arrest patients who survived report near-death experiences. The experiences are very similar among them. They sometimes report being above their bodies and seeing the doctor's work. Some have experiences of walking through a tunnel, being with people they knew who had died. This is his description of the accounts that he's heard. Many experienced a peaceful and calming presence of a divine figure. And not all, though, he said, had pleasant experiences. There's a small number who had pretty negative experiences. And for those, it changed their lives, just like the positive experience changed the lives of those who had a positive experience. And what most of them recount, however, is a peacefulness and a beauty and a goodness and a sense of God's presence during this period of time. So last week I asked, and the last couple of weeks, I asked members of our congregation, if you had a near-death experience, tell me about it. And I had close to 100 near-death experiences that were sent to me. People in our congregation, those who watch worship on TV or online, nearly 100 of these stories that were sent. And I wanted to share with you a few of them. I struggled to narrow them down, and even now I'm cutting out a number of them that are in my manuscript just for time. But here, Gretchen wrote this. She said at some point, one of the teams, so she's in the emergency room, some of the team said, she's dropping fast. I closed my eyes. In the next moment, I stood in an entrance. My grandmothers were there. They reached to me. My father-in-law was there. And then a hand touched my back, and I knew that hand, just like you'd know the feel of your parents' hand. I knew that hand. The words I heard were, "It's not your time." And then I was back in the procedure room. Joanne describes being 12 and getting in trouble swimming off the coast of California. She was with a friend, and they were drawn into the riptide and being sucked under the water. And she said, the next thing I remember is that I'm pulled under the water. Then I find myself in the sky above, looking at a bright tunnel of light. All my senses were more than 100%. I felt more alive than I ever had. At the same time, I saw my life, all 12 years, evaluated in a flash. Then I remember looking down at the ocean and seeing my body floating, my friend's body floating too. At that moment, I knew I had more to do here on earth. Then suddenly I was back in the ocean. A man appeared who took my hand and took the hand of my friend, and he pulled us back to the shore. I think of the story, actually, the story of Nancy, and this was just kind of fun. She said that she got a glimpse of heaven through her husband's eyes before he died. And she said when he regained consciousness, so he had been in a coma. When he regained consciousness, he said, "Did you think I was going to die?" And I said, "Yes." His reply was, "Well, I came back." He told me about seeing this bright light, and then his face just lit up when he told me he had seen his dad and my dad. No one believed that he'd really seen them. I asked if he talked to my dad, and he said yes. And he told me, and I said, "Well, what did he say to you?" And he said, "He told me not to be a schmuck." I started laughing because that's exactly what my dad would say. My dad told him he should come back and say goodbye to people. And that's what he did. He lived 2 more weeks and was able to say goodbye to his friends. I'm skipping through so many great stories, but I want to end with this one. Scott grew up on a cattle ranch in Missouri. He was 13 when he had open heart surgery, and he described what happened during the surgery. He said, "I remember the lights of the surgery, the people, and then drifting off. But next, I was not there on the table. I was near the ceiling looking down. I felt so light, so warm, so loved on God's lap watching the surgery. We were looking down on my body, and I was hearing the voices in the room, but I was not in that space. I was surrounded by this amazing light, a light that can only be described as absolute, unconditional love, just for me. A light not to be seen, but deeply felt. And I knew this was really home." And then he was resuscitated and lived to tell the story for the rest of his life. These are just a few samplings of the many stories that I received that point to the same things Dr. Parnia talked about. And some would explain these as the brain shutting down and what happens when the brain is shutting down. But Dr. Parnia says, the brain has stopped. And yet these experiences are happening, and they might just point to something more. They might just point to what the Christian faith has always said, that you have a soul, you have a consciousness that is a gift from God, and that when this earthly life is over, we have a building not made by human hands, eternal in the heavens.